From Nikita Mazepin, who could barely make it through a race without spinning, to the master of crashes, Pastor Maldonado, these are some Formula One drivers that were so bad they'll never be forgotten. Let's start with the guy who became a controversial figure even before he'd had his first race, Nikita Mazepin. I mean, F1 has had plenty of paid drivers in the past. You know, those who get onto the grid because of their wealthy fathers or sponsorship connections. But it wouldn't be wrong to say that Mazepin was easily the worst of the bunch. For starters, he was caught in a scandal after a video of him groping a young woman surfaced on social media. Oh, and this happened before he'd made his debut. Since his father's company was financing Haas, however, they let that incident slide and let him race for the season. And what followed was nothing short of absolute disaster. Mazepin was paired with another rookie, Mick Schumacher, who, let's be fair, wasn't exactly spectacular himself, but even when he wasn't performing well, the German still managed to beat Mazepin by a country mile. Seriously, the Russian driver lost their qualifying head-to-head 19-0. With an average time difference of almost 1 second. That's insane in Formula One terms. And to make matters worse, he wasn't any good in races either, as he not only failed to get anywhere beyond the last couple of positions, but just kept losing control of his car in the first few laps of almost every race. In fact, it sort of became an in-joke within the Formula One community that a race weekend isn't complete without a signature spin from Nikita Mazepin, or as they called it, Maz's spin. And, well, after a horrendous season, he was kicked out of the sport following Russia's invasion of Ukraine because his father had close ties with Vladimir Putin. But while Mazepin's career never really got going, Daniil Kvyat had plenty of chances to become a top F1 driver. Now, he did show plenty of promise coming into the sport, as he'd won both the Formula One Renault Alps and GP3 titles before joining Toro Rosso. In fact, he was honestly good for the Red Bull Junior team too, since he finished P9 in his debut Grand Prix and got promoted to Red Bull the following year in 2015. The issue, however, was that he just failed to fulfill his potential. And, well, his struggles lined up perfectly with the rise of a young Max Verstappen. To make matters worse, though, Kvyat sorta got into the habit of getting himself involved in incidents on track and racked up a reputation for barging into other drivers. The 2016 Chinese Grand Prix in particular was a dark day for the Russian, as he crashed straight into Sebastian Vettel in the opening corner. Oh, and yeah, this is the same race where Vettel coined the term torpedo for Kvyat, which of course turned into this whole meme afterward. Now, fans hoped that this would be a one-off incident, but it really wasn't, because at his home race in Sochi, Kvyat collided with Vettel twice in 2 corners and jeopardized his teammate Daniel Ricciardo's race. I mean, this was such a bad showing from him that Red Bull advisor Helmut Marko called it a day of disaster, and well, by the time we arrived in Spain for the next race, Kvyat had already been replaced by Max Verstappen. The Russian then struggled as a benchmarker for the next few races before fading into obscurity. Speaking of fading into obscurity, though, Brendan Hartley had a bizarre Formula One career as well. Now, unlike Kvyat, Hartley was never really the guy in contention for a Formula One seat. In fact, he even failed to perform in junior series like GP2, but after being dropped by Red Bull's driver program, he found success in World Endurance Championship, winning 2 championships and getting a Le Mans 24 Hours victory, and, well, thanks to this impressive showing, he got the opportunity of a lifetime. Because in the most strange turn of events, Hartley was back in a Red Bull facility 7 years after he was axed by the team. He was given a seat at Toro Rosso for the 2018 season and was set to race alongside the young Frenchman Pierre Gasly. Now, I say young because Hartley himself definitely wasn't. I mean, back then, it was super rare for a 27-year-old to get into a Toro Rosso seat, since the team was designed to develop young, exciting drivers for Red Bull. Still, who turned down that opportunity, right? Yeah, except that for some reason, Hartley could never replicate his endurance racing form in Formula One. He was involved in multiple big crashes throughout the season, especially during free practice sessions, which cost the team a lot of money. Not to mention, the Kiwi driver also finished the season in 19th, some 4 places and 25 points behind his much less experienced teammate, Gasly. So even though he was genuinely one of the nicest guys on the grid, Red Bull had to quietly let him go for the second time. You know who else was a nice guy though? Nicholas Latifi. Except that unlike Hartley, he actually outstayed his welcome in Formula One. Don't get me wrong, the Canadian was also a pretty decent driver in his junior years, as he finished P2 in the 2019 Formula 2 Championship. However, the fact that he got promoted to F1 ahead of the guy who was first, Nyck de Vries, sorta sums up his stint in the sport. You see, Latifi was also what you'd call a pay driver, as his dad financed much of Williams' development, especially at a time when they were struggling to remain in Formula One. Though while you can say that the team benefited from him outside the track, the same can't be said for his on-track antics. Now, there wasn't anything inherently wrong with his driving style, as he usually ran by himself at the back of the grid, but he was still bad enough to crash even when he wasn't being challenged by another driver. In fact, remember that whole championship drama between Hamilton and Verstappen at Abu Dhabi? Well, that was triggered by an unforced Latifi crash too. I mean, the dude was such a bad driver and would trigger the safety car so often that people ironically started referring to him as Goatifi. Not to mention, he was outpaced by both of his teammates Alex Albon and George Russell in the 3 years he spent at Williams. The last straw, however, was when Nyck de Vries, who didn't even know he'd be racing, stepped into a sick Albon seat and comfortably beat Latifi in Italy. That said, while Latifi was just straight up bad, Romain Grosjean's issues went much deeper than that. I mean, he was one of the most promising young drivers when he stepped into the sport with Renault in 2009. But while his first stint didn't quite work, he came back in 2012 to drive for Lotus. Now, this was a pretty special time for him, as he consistently scored points for his team, and even scored a bunch of podiums, which was super impressive. Like, he was fast, and you can't take that away from him. The problem, however, was with his wild inconsistency. Seriously, he'd make the most puzzling decisions while racing, going in for gaps that just didn't exist, and this of course resulted in some very costly blunders and crashes. In fact, in 2012, he became the only driver since 1994 to receive a race ban for dangerous driving after causing a massive collision at Spa. What's more, he also had the tendency to crash under the safety car, which honestly is kinda insane. Take his crash during the 2018 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, for example. He was literally just warming up his tires while weaving behind the safety car when he randomly turned too hard and crashed into the barriers. Oh, and funnily enough, he blamed Marcus Ericsson for it, when the Swede was nowhere near him on track. And so after a frustrating few years with Haas, Romain Grosjean finally quit the sport after his horrific crash in Bahrain. Now, most of these drivers had a habit of crashing throughout their stints in F1, but no one comes even close to the master of crashes himself, Pastor Maldonado. I mean, let's get one thing clear. This guy was fast. Well, at least on days when he wasn't busy playing bumper cars on track. Seriously, this guy was an absolute menace on race day. And if you were one of the other guys racing with him, yeah, you would have preferred to stay 200 miles away from him. In 2012, he crashed in the final laps of the opening race in Australia. Then in the same year, he barged straight into Sergio Perez in Monaco, ending both of their races. Honestly, if I started listing down his crashes, we'd be here all day. But the 2012 Belgian Grand Prix was something out of this world because somehow Maldonado managed to rack up 3 penalties in the same race. First, he blocked Hülkenberg in quali, then jumped the start, and only a few laps later ran straight into Timo Glock. Not to mention, this came in the middle of a spectacular 7-race streak, where Maldonado either crashed, got a penalty, or had some other incident. He was truly the agent of chaos, and eventually his contract was terminated before the 2016 season. So, from the master of crashes, Pastor Maldonado, to Nikita Mazepin, who could barely make it through a race without spinning, these were some Formula One drivers that were so bad they'll never be forgotten.